This is the final major climb I rode during my week in Tenerife, and it's another way up Mount Teide. This is the main stretch starting from Chío, which you can reach via a few different routes from sea level. The segment I'm riding is the Carretera Boca Torce climb, which is about 25 kilometers at 5.5% for a total ascent of 1,384 meters, or about 4,500 feet. It's not really a climber's climb, as 5 and 6% gradients are very draftable, and external factors like wind have the potential to make a huge difference. No nice reds on this profile, just looks like a slice of cheese. I much prefer the steeper stuff, but if it's going uphill, can't complain too much. I actually attempted this a few days earlier, but the weather just got increasingly worse as I climbed, with dangerous winds and rain making it a challenge to ride in a straight line, so I bailed a few kilometers from the top. This is where I gave up, which as you can see is painfully close to the summit, but it's after a turn in the road which leaves you fully exposed to the wind as it gets funneled between the hills. The weather was a bit sketchy when I started and probably should have known better, with ridiculous winds and some rain about, but I didn't realise just how bad it would get. I always assume that when you're climbing you can kind of push through any conditions and you just have to worry when it comes to descending, but as I learned that's not true, especially in exposed environments. I was really keen to get to the top again before leaving the island, and my parents were kind enough to meet me at the top with clothes I could put on for the descent. This time I was well prepared and packed just about everything I had. When I set off here it was, as you can see, a lovely day, and clearly being ultra aero with my flappy gilet. I was pretty fatigued on this day, being at the end of the week, but I still wanted to do a decent effort up the climb. You might have noticed the trend of me saying how terrible my legs feel in every video, which I basically say every day of my life, ever, which probably really annoys all my friends and family. Well, I only have about 2 friends, so. I can't actually imagine what having good legs would feel like, and I'd probably just perform terribly because it'd be such a shock. As usual, I just rode this to feel. The climb itself is very straightforward. In this segment there aren't any junctions or turns, you're just on a nice scenic road all the way to the top. There's very few bends and it's not the most exciting climb, but the scenery is still quite unique as you transition into the volcanic landscape. On a clear day you also get great views of the volcano itself, although as we'll see in a minute the blue skies didn't stay around. The road sweeps around back on itself after just over 5k, and you enter a slightly more sheltered section surrounded by pine trees. There's not really a huge amount to say about the first portion of this climb. There's very few distinguishable points apart from a restaurant and a few little viewpoints. I just kind of chugged along, having settled into a comfortable pace, feeling a bit sluggish, but on the whole okay and just kind of enjoying it. I ended up staying in the big ring for the whole of this climb, so it felt very different from the steep stuff. I actually find it easier to do steeper stuff when I'm fatigued. On more gentle gradients I really have to force myself to push hard, as it's easy to ease off if you lose concentration. Even though I had over an hour of climbing ahead of me, it wasn't mentally daunting, since I had done a longer climb from Los Cristianos to the top a few days earlier. It's funny how quickly you adjust to kind of long climbs and things. A few weeks ago a 20-minute climb felt really long, but after just a few longer efforts it didn't feel too crazy to be going uphill for 15 miles. After about half an hour the sun went into hiding and the temperatures started to drop, and this was in exactly the same place that the weather took a turn for the worse a few days earlier. So I started to get a bit scared when I felt a few raindrops. I hadn't felt the wind too much up until this point, but it started to pick up a bit, kind of the same time the rain started, which was conveniently a lovely cross headwind. The wind direction on Tenerife seems to be generally northerly, so it's probably often a headwind in this section. I certainly wasn't very aero, but I try not to stand up quite as much, as I felt a bit like a sail in the wind. And there's these little sections where the side of the road drops away, and you can really feel it there. It's pretty hard to pick out where you are on the climb. I kept thinking I was on a certain section, where I was actually in a completely different place, just because it all looks kind of the same. I was starting to think it would be a repeat experience as I felt more rain, but it definitely wasn't as bad as a few days earlier, so I kept going. I was planning on bailing if it looked truly horrendous again, as if I had to get a lift down it would just ruin my parents' day again, and I was already being enough of a burden on their lovely holiday. The wind and rain picked up as I went along, and it's really the combination of the two that makes you just get quite cold. The temperatures themselves weren't that low, although it had dropped pretty quickly. But my hands and kind of skin was starting to get really numb. Since my handlebars were wet and I wasn't wearing gloves, my hands were just slipping off the bars. So I made a quick pit stop. Thankfully my parents were nearby, so my dad handed some gloves to me, which I struggled to get on a bit due to the numb hands, and it's a bit painful to see myself losing precious time of this meaningless hill, standing on the side of the road. A shout out to Thomas for providing the decathlon goods in the form of these brilliant fluoro gloves. And once I entered the bad weather, any worries about tired legs kind of went out the window because I was kind of just distracted by being cold and worrying about the weather getting worse. So in some ways it actually became easier because even though my feet and hands and things were going numb, I was no longer worrying about my legs. It sounds a bit silly, but I often have the tendency to fixate on how terrible I feel, which doesn't really help. And this bend here is where you'd usually get a nice view of the volcano, which is where I took this photo a few days earlier. In the last few kilometers, it actually started to brighten up again, which seems to often be the case up Teide. It's kind of like a microclimate, so nice at the bottom, kind of horrible in the middle, and then really nice at the top. And this is a video my mum took from the top. You can see the clouds rolling in, it's quite cool. as I made this last bend, thankfully the headwind kind of changed into a bit more of a tailwind, which provided a nice little extra kick of motivation to do the last 5 minutes or so. So there we have it. It's not really my favourite type of climb in terms of just, getting the suffer on and generating as much power as possible, but it's really pleasant and kind of hard not to enjoy. The road can get relatively busy with tourists driving to the top, but as it's quite a major non-technical road, it didn't cause any problems. So yeah, I was really happy to just get up there again, to be honest. Thank you very much to my parents for helping me out, because there's no way I would have continued climbing through those bad conditions knowing I had to descend all the way through it again. It's not just a little descent you can whiz down. You're going to be going down there for a decent chunk of time, and if you just get too cold, it can just get really, really miserable and a bit sketchy. Especially given the little bonking experience I had a few days earlier, and that wasn't even cold and I was struggling. And the funny thing was that when I descended it, all the clouds that had been hanging around had completely vanished, or they'd at least blown into a different part, which was kind of bizarre, but also shows how quickly conditions can change, and the little microclimates you find on the mountain. But I very much appreciated it, because it would have been a very grim descent if it hadn't been sunny, because I was still pretty cold, even with about 5 layers on. So this effort was about 1 hour and 15 minutes at around 230 watts. It's about 20 watts down on my best kind of power for that duration, but yeah, whatever. Had a great time, and that's all you can ask for. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next installation of my wheel.